The theme of this episode is that heaven and earth are impartial. We are going to introduce Laozi's Chapter 5. The content of Chapter 5 is quite familiar to everyone, but some parts may easily cause misunderstandings. Let me first read the original text. Laozi Chapter 5. Heaven and earth are not kind, they treat all things as straw dogs. The sage is not kind, he treats the people as straw dogs. The space between heaven and earth is like a bellows, empty but inexhaustible. The more it moves, the more comes out. Too much speech leads to exhaustion, better to hold to the center. Let's first translate this into colloquial language. Heaven and earth have no partiality. They treat all things like straw dogs, letting them prosper and perish on their own. The sage is also impartial, treating the people as straw dogs, allowing them to flourish and decline on their own. The space between heaven and earth is like a bellows, though empty, it never runs out. A single movement produces endless energy. Too much discussion quickly leads to exhaustion. It's better to maintain a principle of stillness. There are several terms here that clearly need explanation. First, what does not kind, 不仁, mean? This is the first time we see Laozi use the term heaven and earth. Heaven and earth refer to all things, representing the idea that all things grow between heaven and earth, and the coordination of time and space is necessary for the growth of all things. But there are so many things, and they all take turns to flourish and decay. What does not kind mean? In Laozi's context, kind ren primarily refers to having good intentions and showing special care. This is what Laozi criticizes. For example, when a person intends to do something good, there is already a judgment involved. This inevitably leads to subjectivity, selfishness, and bias. Therefore, translating Laozi's not kind as impartiality is more appropriate. Thus, heaven and earth are not kind means heaven and earth are impartial, not that heaven and earth lack compassion or virtue. In the Zhuangzi, chapter The Great and Venerable Teacher, it is also mentioned that the way of the Tao does not show mercy for 10,000 generations and is not considered kind. Benefiting all things is not kindness, and when all things eventually perish, it is not cruelty either. This explains the impartiality of heaven and earth. Next, heaven and earth treat all things as straw dogs. The important point here is, what are straw dogs? In Wang Bai's commentary, the explanation of these two characters is clearly misunderstood. In Zhuangzi, chapter The Music of Heaven, there is a vivid description of straw dogs. Zhuangzi says that in ancient times, during ancestral sacrifices, straw dogs were placed beside the ancestral tablets for companionship during the ceremony. Before the ceremony, the straw dogs received special treatment. They were placed in precious boxes, covered with embroidered cloth, and those in charge of the ceremony fasted to receive them. However, after the ceremony, these straw dogs, being made of grass, were discarded. Passers-by might step on them, or woodcutters might take them to burn as fuel. What does this illustrate? It shows that all things in heaven and earth have their time of flourishing and decay. For example, certain flowers bloom this month, but next month they will wither, allowing other flowers to take the stage. This is the cycle of life. Once they step down, they return to the ordinary, experiencing birth and death like all other things. From this, we understand that heaven and earth treat all things as impartial, providing a place for them to exist without showing any special care. This makes it easier to understand the second sentence, the sage is not kind, he treats the people as straw dogs. From this, we know that the sage is truly a ruler, just as the timing, seasons, and climate of heaven and earth affect the flourishing and decay of all things, so too do the actions of the sage affect the prosperity and decline of the people. This sentence should be understood as the sage being impartial, considering the overall development and allowing different regions to take turns in economic development. For example, treating the people as straw dogs means that if coastal areas are to develop first, then they develop first, followed by inland areas. This arrangement follows the conditions and circumstances, without personal preference or dislike, just like the natural order of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Since heaven and earth refer to all things, and heaven and earth are also part of all things, the sage refers to the people, which means that the sage is also part of the people. Next, we need to discuss the phrase the space between heaven and earth is like a bellows. To put it simply, it's a bellows. When you smelt copper or iron, you need a bellows. The bellows are empty, and some leaf plates work together to create airflow, continuously generating power and making the fire burn hotter. So, the space between heaven and earth is like a bellows. Though it is empty, it continuously drives the existence and development of all things, taking turns to come forth and thrive endlessly. This is followed by the phrase heaven and earth, though empty, do not become depleted. One movement produces endless energy. These two lines remind us that there is vast space between heaven and earth, where all things thrive and develop continuously. Ancient Chinese people regarded heaven and earth as parents. For example, in the I Ching trigrams, there is symbolism where Qian heaven and Kuan earth are seen as the father and mother, giving birth to the 6 remaining trigrams, 3 male and 3 female. This was an ancient view that treated heaven and earth as parents. So when Laozi talks about heaven and earth as a bellows, it represents a vast place where all things can thrive and develop. When Laozi talks about nature, he uses the 4 characters heaven and earth, all things. Heaven and earth and all things refer to the natural world, and heaven and earth are part of all things. This is similar to the way sages relate to the people. Sages are also one of the people. How do they become sages? It requires a variety of cultivation methods, which we will explore later in Laozi's teachings on cultivation. Once someone becomes a sage, a ruler, they are responsible for ensuring that the people live in peace and happiness, just as heaven and earth provide a place for all things to grow. However, all things must take turns to come forth according to their respective conditions, and this provides an excellent metaphor for the role of the sage. The sage treats the people in the same way heaven and earth treat all things. Therefore, when learning Laozi's teachings, we must first establish a clear understanding heaven and earth do not create all things. Heaven and earth and all things belong to the same category, and all come from the Tao. This fundamental idea will reappear in the future. Heaven and earth and all things come from the Tao, but heaven and earth serve as a vast place where all things can live and grow. Similarly, the sage and the people are all part of humanity, but the sage, through special cultivation, gains wisdom by understanding the Tao and takes on the role of a ruler. Thus, the sage treats the people as heaven and earth treat all things, providing a place for them to live and grow but without favoritism. In Daoism, terms like benevolence and righteousness are sometimes viewed with suspicion. For example, in Zhuangzi, similar ideas are expressed: the great man is not benevolent, the ruler of benevolence is not benevolent, and the ruler of benevolence has no relatives. These phrases in Zhuangzi have a similar meaning. The highest level of benevolence does not involve favoring specific people, it must treat everyone equally. Because if a sage shows favoritism to some people, it will inevitably lead to neglecting others, and things will become increasingly complicated. Eventually, corruption and self-interest will arise, and people will start looking out for their own friends and family. Wouldn't the world then fall into chaos? Therefore, Laozi believes that heaven and earth, like a bellows, is empty but can accommodate all things. It provides an inexhaustible source of energy that allows all things to grow and evolve according to their own nature. The original text concludes with the statement, "Too much speech leads to exhaustion, better to hold to the center." This means that too much discussion can quickly lead to a dead end. So, what should be done instead? It's better to hold to the center. The term center dong here refers to a state of stillness and calm. The center is like the human heart, which must remain calm and humble, in order to accommodate others' opinions. Therefore, the phrase holding to the center refers to always adhering to the principle of stillness and humility. This is the only way to allow all things to fulfill their own potential and activities, enabling development to flourish endlessly and continuously. So, what do we learn from this episode? We learn Laozi's concept of heaven and earth, where heaven and earth and all things together represent the natural world, or nature itself. However, Laozi's writings also use the word natural 自然, but in a slightly different context. Laozi's concept of natural does not always refer to the natural world. When we encounter this word later, we will provide a more detailed explanation. So, the relationship between heaven and earth and all things can be compared to the relationship between the sage and the people. This once again emphasizes that the sage is an enlightened ruler. Therefore, when we say heaven and earth are not kind and the sage is not kind, it does not mean that they lack compassion or care for the well-being of all things or the people. Instead, Laozi's concept of not kind refers to impartiality. Heaven, earth, and the sage, like the Tao itself, do not show favoritism. The sage, with deep wisdom, considers all conditions and factors and is able to make decisions that are in the best interest of everyone as a whole. This is the core lesson from this chapter. We must also reflect on the last sentence, too much speech leads to exhaustion. In fact, it does not necessarily mean running out of ideas, but rather becoming overwhelmed. So, what should we do? We should hold to the center, remain calm, and observe how external situations develop. Rather than expressing many complex opinions, it is better to understand the trends and shifts in the external world, maintaining the principle of calmness and stillness. This way, we can adapt to changing circumstances and handle things in a way that allows for smooth development. At the same time, we now have a clearer understanding of the term straw dogs. In Unbiased commentary, he explains it incorrectly by treating straw as grass and dogs as actual animals, suggesting that animals eat grass, and humans eat dogs. This explanation is clearly mistaken. So here, we learn that people, like all things, cannot escape the fate of being treated as straw dogs. They flourish when it is their time and wither when their time passes. They rise to prominence when their conditions are right and decline when the time comes. This is a natural cycle that no one can change. Understanding this concept allows us to view our own circumstances with a different perspective. So, how do you feel about these ideas? I'd love to hear your thoughts.